Welcome to Fantastic Stories. The UFO Disclosure Begins. For the first time in decades, the United States government has begun releasing a large new collection of declassified UAP materials, including military footage, historical reports, pilot testimonies, radar cases, and even archival astronaut recordings connected to early NASA missions. And almost immediately, the internet exploded. Some people celebrated the release as historic transparency, others called it underwhelming, and perhaps most interestingly, many of the most prominent voices inside the UFO community seem genuinely conflicted, because this release creates a strange paradox. On one hand, something clearly changed. Governments do not casually publish military UFO files, astronaut transcripts, infrared recordings, or decades of historical reports, unless something significant has changed behind the scenes. But on the other hand, the actual content of the release does not appear dramatically different from material that has already circulated publicly for years. We once again see distant lights, poor image quality, unresolved military encounters, and unexplained observations without definitive conclusions. And this is precisely why reactions have become so divided. Investigative journalist Ross Coulthard and former intelligence official Lou Elizondo both described the release as somewhat disappointing, arguing that the most anticipated materials, including the rumored set of additional military UAP videos, have still not been published. Others within the disclosure movement described the release as low-hanging fruit, suggesting that the government might be selectively releasing less sensitive material while withholding more significant evidence. At the same time, several political figures continue implying that additional disclosure may still come. Representative Tim Burchett suggested that this may represent only the first stage of a larger process, while Congressman Eric Burlinson recently hinted that he may personally push for further release if transparency slows down. And this creates an unusual atmosphere, part disclosure, part political theater, part public pressure campaign, and part psychological experiment. Because one increasingly important question is no longer, are UFOs real? The real question now is, why is the information being released in this particular way? Some observers believe this is gradual disclosure. According to this interpretation, governments may be slowly normalizing the topic to reduce cultural shock and public stigma over time. And interestingly, this pattern already appears visible. Only a few years ago, only discussing UFO seriously could damage a politician's or scientist's reputation. Now, former presidents joke about aliens publicly, members of Congress discuss interdimensional beings, military officials openly describe anomalous crafts, and government agencies release UAP files directly into the public domain. Something has clearly shifted. However, another interpretation is far more cynical. Some critics argue that these releases might function less as transparency and more as controlled narrative management. In other words, give the public enough material to maintain fascination, but not enough to reach definitive conclusions. Enough mystery to sustain attention, enough ambiguity to prevent closure. And this criticism intensified after many viewers realized that several newly released videos resemble earlier military footage already familiar to the public. For some observers, the release felt less like disclosure and more like appetizer. Or, as some frustrated commentators described it, a lollipop combined with a slap in the face. At the same time, several files did attract significant attention. One widely discussed case involved a star-shaped object recorded in infrared. Another showed a glowing orb-like object near wind turbines. Historical military reports included classic flying saucer descriptions dating back to the late 1940s. And perhaps most intriguing were the NASA materials, including astronauts' communication describing unusual lights and unidentified objects observed during early space missions. In one Gemini-era transcript, Astronaut Frank Borman reported a boogie accompanied by what he described as hundreds of small particles moving nearby. Meanwhile, Apollo mission archives include discussions of unusual light sources and unexplained luminous objects observed near the spacecraft and above the lunar horizon. Importantly, none of these recordings prove extraterrestrial life, but their release create an uncomfortable contradiction. For years, institutions such as NASA publicly emphasized scientific caution and transparency, while simultaneously appearing reluctant to engage deeply with UFO-related material. Now, archival astronaut recordings involving unidentified objects are suddenly entering mainstream public discourse. This does not necessarily imply conspiracy, but it does raise an uncomfortable question. If these materials were considered significant, then why were they archived, classified, and monitored so carefully for decades in the first place? It does reinforce the perception that governments and institutions may have publicly minimized the subject while discussing it more seriously internally. And politically, the timing is difficult to ignore. Donald Trump repeatedly suggested during public appearances that additional UAP information may eventually be released. Now, whether someone supports him politically or not, many observers argue that he at least partially delivered on the promise. Not conclusively, but something was released. And this may be exactly why reactions remain so mixed, because the release simultaneously validates and disappoints the UFO community. It validates the claim that governments possess larger archives on UAP-related material than previously acknowledged, but it disappoints those expecting clear proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. And perhaps this tension is intentional. If gradual disclosure is occurring, then ambiguity might actually be the strategy itself. Too much information at once could trigger institutional and geopolitical chaos, religious panic, or scientific crisis. Too little information, however, risks losing public interest entirely. Perhaps this is exactly how modern disclosure would occur, not through one shocking revelation, but through gradual psychological adaptation. Enough to normalize the topic while still maintaining uncertainty. And notably, the transformation is no longer happening only within conspiracy culture. It now involves presidents, Congress, military agencies, scientists, journalists, Hollywood directors, social media, and mainstream news channels. Even popular culture appears increasingly synchronized with the discussion. Steven Spielberg, whose films helped define modern alien imagery for generations, is now returning to UFO-related themes precisely as political and military discussion surrounding UAPs becomes more normalized. So, the boundaries between entertainment, politics, science, and mythology are becoming blurred, and perhaps that is the most important development of all. Because regardless of what UAPs ultimately are, the phenomenon is no longer fringe. It has entered mainstream political, scientific, and cultural discourse. The real story might therefore not be the files themselves. The real story might be that governments have finally decided the public is psychologically ready to participate in the conversation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing to my channel. Have a great day and see you next time.